Well, I can tell you that that's actually not true.
Right.
So that's another one of the sort of popular myths. There's so many myths that sort of get spouted around and become part of our popular folklore. So the 90% that we only use 10% of our brains is one of those really popular myths. So you use all of your brain all the time. And so if you look across your brain, there are probably 70% of your brain is devoted to vision. And humans are a massively visual species. And so if you look, for example, in a rat, at least half of its brain is devoted to the sense of smell, because it's a very olfactory species. So if you look in humans, the visual cortex is big, so this is part of the brain back here. So information from your eyes, first place it goes is, well, it sort of goes to some deeper areas, but then it also goes back here. But then as those areas, that information gets sort of initially processed back there, and then it moves forward to the next areas, which start to figure out what it is and where it is and how you might interact with it. And then there are other parts even further forward that deal with your motivations to act on that and what we're going to pay attention to visually. So that's 70% of your brain right there. Just to have a cup of coffee and reach out and pick it up, that's 70% of your brain. People do neuroimaging studies, which are looking not at brain, we think they're looking at neurons, but it's really just looking at blood flow in your brain. But if your brain takes massive quantities of your oxygen load, because your brain is a hog in terms of the amount of energy and oxygen that it takes compared to the rest of your body. But if you think really, 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 really hard, it's only a teeny tiny bit more than if you're asleep. So most of what your brain is doing, in fact your whole brain, is involved in basic vision, basic hearing, basic understanding of what things are and where they are, keeping you from falling over, keeping your heart beating, all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, so we use all of our brain all the time. Like tying your shoes, massive amount of brain power. So, but I don't know if that answered your other question about what happens to the dead neurons.
Yeah, what does happen to those?
They sort of shrivel up and disappear. So if you think about a neuron, so we have, hard to know, somewhere in the neighborhood of between 20 billion and 200 billion neurons, which is crazy what a range that is. It's a range of 180 billion that it could be off by. But, because it turns out to be really hard to count, actually. And there are people who are working really, really hard on figuring out how many there are and how they connect to each other, which is the way bigger question. Yeah, seriously. Well, they take a look at sort of centimeter by centimeter. They might count how many are in that, and then they extrapolate to how many there would be everywhere. But of course, they're not the same density everywhere, and it takes a long time to count up to even 20 billion. And so we're just guessing, really, how many are in there, and we have absolutely no idea how they connect to each other. So has anyone heard of the Connectome project? So this is the new thing in brains is actually trying to figure out how different brain areas are connected to each other, which you would think you would know because that's like basic anatomy. But it turns out to be phenomenally hard to figure out because a neuron might be this long. It might go from here to here. And you can't put something that big all on its own under a microscope. It's too big. And so it turns out that mapping something that's invisible to the human eye on its own that's actually this long is really, really, really hard. So that's why we don't know how many we have. But in answer to the question of what happens to the ones, so we have this infant with all of these neurons. Their dead ones just kind of shrivel up and become raw material, and there are all these little garbage collectors that float around in your brain and pick up all the bits and pieces and sweep them away. And they're gone. But what a brain does do, so your brain is bigger than an infant's brain. So that was a puzzle for a while, is if the baby's brain has more neurons, why is your brain bigger than a baby's brain? And it's the neurons, a baby's brain's neurons, when you get to each end of a neuron, there's a receiving end where it picks up stuff from other neurons, and then there's action potential where it fires, and then there's a sending end where it sends messages off to other neurons, how they talk. And we those connections, particularly at the receiving end, they have branches called dendrites, which is sort of Latin for tree branch, I think. Something like that. So they're like branches on trees. And so what happens during development is you sprout lots of new branches. So the neurons that you have that work well will sprout more branches so that they have better connectivity. So your brain is bigger because the neurons that you kept actually got bigger. They branched out more and proliferated at the ends so that they could talk to other neurons.